By 1942, the German secret police in occupied France were hunting a ghost. Somewhere in the south, someone was running escape lines for shot-down Allied airmen, breaking captured agents out of prison, arming resistance fighters, and feeding a stream of intelligence to London. And the Gestapo could not catch this person or even name them. They knew only two things for certain. Their most dangerous enemy in France was a woman, and she walked with a limp. They plastered the region with wanted posters hunting the Limping Lady, and one Gestapo officer wrote the verdict that would follow her ever after. She was, he said, the most dangerous of all Allied spies. What the Germans never discovered was that the woman they feared most was an American, and that she was doing all of it on a wooden leg. Her name was Virginia Hall. She was from Baltimore, and by the time the Gestapo were papering France with posters of her, she had already spent more than a year building one of the most effective resistance networks in the country. Under their noses, in the city of Lyon. To the French she helped, she was Germaine, or Marie Monin, or simply the American Lady. To London, she was one of the most valuable agents they had. To the Germans, she was a description and a nickname and a growing, gnawing fear. And she had a secret that would have seemed, to anyone who knew it, like a fatal weakness for a spy on the run. Below her left knee, Virginia Hall's leg was made of wood. She had lost the leg years before the war, in a hunting accident, and wore a heavy prosthetic she had, with characteristic defiance, given a name, Cuthbert. A limp is a terrible thing for someone trying to disappear. It is exactly the kind of distinctive feature a witness remembers and a policeman writes down. And in fact, the limp was the one thing the Gestapo did have on her. And yet Hall used everything else about herself to vanish. She changed her hair, her clothes, her name, her manner. By some accounts, she could become several different women in a single day. She built her networks patiently, trusted carefully, and moved constantly. For a long time, the description of a limping woman was all the enemy could get, because everything else about her kept changing, and her networks did an extraordinary amount. From Lyon, Virginia Hall recruited and ran agents, set up a chain of safe houses, and organized escape routes that smuggled downed Allied airmen and escaped prisoners of war out of France and on to freedom. She gathered intelligence on German troop movements and sent it to London. She helped supply and coordinate resistance groups, and in one of her most audacious operations, she helped mastermind the escape of a group of captured SOE agents from a French prison, getting Britain's own spies out of a cell and back into the field. For nearly the entire time, the Gestapo knew someone was doing all this. They just could not find the limping woman who was. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like and stay with us all the way to the end. The man who wanted her most was one of the worst human beings the war produced. Klaus Barbie was the Gestapo chief in Lyon, and he earned a nickname of his own, the Butcher of Lyon. He personally tortured prisoners, and he sent thousands of French Jews and captured resistance members to concentration camps and to their deaths. This is the man who was hunting Virginia Hall, and we say plainly what he was, because it is the measure of what she was up against. Barbie made catching the Limping Lady a personal obsession. He is reported to have sworn that he would give anything to get his hands on her. He circulated her wanted posters. He put his informers and double agents to work trying to learn her name. He never did. She stayed ahead by being better at the work than the men chasing her. Hall understood that a spy's real armor is ordinariness, being unremarkable, unmemorable, unworthy of a second glance. She cultivated cover identities, including posing as a newspaper reporter, which gave a foreigner a plausible reason to move around and ask questions. She learned which officials could be bribed and which neighbors could be trusted. She managed the brutal arithmetic of a spy master. Every person she recruited was both an asset and a risk, because any one of them, under torture, could bring the whole network down. She carried the weight of other people's lives constantly, and she carried it, by every account, with a cool nerve that the men around her found remarkable. The danger was total and constant. An agent captured in occupied France did not face a prisoner of war camp. They faced interrogation by men like Barbie, and very often torture and execution. The networks Hall built were always one betrayal away from collapse, and over the course of the war, many agents, brave men and women doing exactly what she did, were caught and did not come home. Hall knew all of this in precise detail. She had seen colleagues arrested. She operated every single day with the knowledge that a single informer, a single unlucky checkpoint, a single person who remembered a limp could end with her in Barbie's cellar. She kept working anyway, for month after month, which is a kind of courage that has nothing to do with a single brave moment and everything to do with enduring the fear for years. In November 1942, the ground shifted under her. The Allies landed in North Africa, and in response the Germans marched into the previously unoccupied southern zone of France and took direct control of the whole country. Overnight, the relative grey space hall had operated and vanished, and the full weight of the German security apparatus came down on the south, with her network in Lyon near the top of its target list. The Gestapo was closer than it had ever been. Staying meant almost certainly capture and death, and so Virginia Hall did the thing that should have been impossible for her, of all people. She decided to walk out of France, over the mountains. The only way out was south, across the Pyrenees, the mountain wall between France and Spain, on foot, in secret, in the dead of winter. It is a punishing route for a fit smuggler in good weather. Hall would attempt it in November snow, climbing to around 7,500 feet, covering roughly 50 miles of high mountain terrain over about 3 days. And she would do it dragging an 8-pound wooden leg strapped to the stump below her knee. Her guides, when they learned who they were taking, objected. They did not want to risk the crossing with a woman, let alone an amputee. Hall refused to be left behind. She went up into the mountains. The crossing was agony. In deep snow, on steep ground, the prosthetic that let her walk on level streets became a torment, heavy, ill-fitting, grinding against her leg with every step, wearing the stump raw as she hauled it up the passes. She could not feel the artificial foot which on ice and rock is its own danger. She fell behind. She pushed on. She climbed for 3 days through cold that could kill an exhausted body. And somewhere on that mountain, in a safe house along the way, she found a moment to radio London and sent one of the most quietly astonishing messages of her war. She reported that she was all right, but added that Cuthbert was giving her trouble. Cuthbert being, of course, her name for her wooden leg. The officer receiving the message in London did not know that. Reading it, and assuming Cuthbert must be some inconvenient person, some agent slowing her down, headquarters sent back a reply that has been retold ever since. If Cuthbert is giving you difficulty, they answered, have him eliminated. Hall, dragging the offending Cuthbert through the snow of the high Pyrenees with a bloodied stump, is said to have found this very funny. It is a small, human, extraordinary moment, a woman making a grim joke to herself on a mountain, in the middle of an escape that was tearing her body apart. She reached Spain, arrested at first for crossing without papers, then freed, and eventually back to London alive, the Limping Lady the Gestapo never caught. And that would be a complete and remarkable story all on its own. But it is only the halfway point. Because to understand how an American woman came to be crossing the Pyrenees on a wooden leg with the Gestapo at her back, and to understand the almost unbelievable thing she chose to do next, we have to stop and go back and look at who Virginia Hall actually was before the war ever found her, and at the strange, secret organizations that were the only ones willing to use her. Before we go back to the beginning, stay for what she did after the mountains, because it is the most incredible chapter of all. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We make these to keep exactly these people from being forgotten. When Hall got back to London, her superiors in the SOE told her the obvious truth. She was too well known now, too burned, her face and her limp too familiar to the Gestapo. They would not send her back into France. For most people, that would have been the honorable end of a heroic war. Virginia Hall treated it as a problem to be solved. If the British would not send her back, she would find someone who would. She found the Americans. In 1944, the United States' own new spy agency, the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime ancestor of the CIA, was expanding into France ahead of the coming invasion, and it needed people who knew the ground. Hall knew it better than almost anyone alive. So the OSS took the woman the SOE had retired as too dangerous to use and sent her back into occupied France, into the same country where the Gestapo still had her posters up. And this time, to survive, she transformed herself completely. She disguised herself as an old peasant woman. She changed her hair to grey, dressed in worn farm clothes, and taught herself to shuffle in a way that hid the telltale limp. Folding her whole distinctive body into the shape of a harmless old milkmaid, nobody would look at twice. What she did this time was help prepare the ground for D-Day and the liberation. Operating in central France under a new code name, Hall worked as a radio operator, one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire secret war. Because the Germans had detector vans that hunted the signals, and a wireless operator caught transmitting, was a wireless operator arrested. She found and mapped drop zones and received parachuted supplies of weapons and equipment. She organized, armed, and helped train French resistance fighters, by some accounts the equivalent of several battalions, for the sabotage and guerrilla operations that would tear up German communications and slow German reinforcements when the Allied armies finally landed. The old milkmaid nobody looked at twice was building an army in the hills. It worked. The networks she helped arm and organize did exactly what such networks were meant to do when the invasion came, harassing the Germans from behind their own lines. Virginia Hall spent almost the entire war inside occupied France, hunted the whole time, and was never caught. But to really grasp the size of that achievement, and to understand why a woman with a wooden leg was doing a job her own country had once told her she could not have. We have to go back, finally, to where she started, to Baltimore, to a hunting accident, and to all the doors that were closed in her face before the secret services opened the only ones that mattered. Virginia Hall was born in 1906 into a well-off Baltimore family, and she was from the start not built for the narrow life expected of a young woman of her class and time. She was clever, athletic, restless, and fluent in several languages, and what she wanted was to see the world and to serve her country as a diplomat. She studied in Paris and Vienna, fell in love with Europe, and set her sights on the United States Foreign Service, and there she ran into the First Wall. In the 1920s and 30s, the American Diplomatic Corps was overwhelmingly a men's club, and it repeatedly passed her over. She was trying to force open a door her own government intended to keep shut. Then, in 1933, while working at a consulate and out hunting, Virginia Hall had the accident that reshaped her life. Her shotgun discharged into her own leg, gangrene set in, and to save her life doctors amputated her left leg below the knee. She was in her mid-20s. She was fitted with the heavy wooden prosthetic she would name Cuthbert, and she taught herself to walk and ride and eventually to climb mountains on it. But the amputation gave the State Department, which had already been reluctant, a formal reason to reject her for good. Regulations of the day barred people with certain disabilities from the diplomatic service. The country she wanted to serve had now told her in writing that she was unfit. It was one of the great misjudgments of its era. When war came, Hall was in Europe, and she threw herself at it, first driving ambulances for the French army as the Germans overran the country in 1940. After France fell, she made her way to Britain, and there she came to the attention of a brand new and unconventional organization, the Special Operations Executive, a secret British service created to, in Churchill's phrase, set Europe ablaze to run sabotage and resistance inside Hitler's occupied territories. The SOE was new enough and desperate enough to do what the diplomatic corps never would. It judged Virginia Hall on what she could do, not on her leg or her sex. It trained her, and it sent her into Vichy France. The organizations willing to risk everything on a disabled woman were the ones fighting the secret war. So that is the woman the Gestapo were hunting. Not a trained soldier, not a career officer, but a Baltimore diplomat's daughter her own government had rejected twice over, once for being a woman, once for being an amputee, who taught herself to walk on a wooden leg, drove ambulances under fire, and then talked her way into the most dangerous work of the war, and turned out to be better at it than almost anyone. Knowing all of that, the doors slammed in her face, the leg, the years of being told what she could not do, does not make her achievements in France smaller. It makes them almost impossible to believe. And it makes what happened to her after the war all the more telling. When the war ended, Virginia Hall was one of the most accomplished secret agents the Allies had produced, and characteristically, she wanted no fanfare about it. In 1945, she was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the United States' second highest military honor, and she remains the only civilian woman to receive it for service in the Second World War. Her citation praised her rare courage, perseverance, and ingenuity, and credited her work as contributing materially to the resistance operations that supported the liberation of France. President Truman wanted to present it to her personally, in a public ceremony. Hall said no. She was still, in her mind, an intelligence officer, and she did not want her face in the newspapers. She received one of the nation's highest awards in a small private office instead. She kept working in the shadows. Virginia Hall joined the newly created Central Intelligence Agency and served as one of its officers through the early Cold War into the 1960s. But the agency of that era did not always know what to do with a woman of her talents, and, in a final echo of the doors that had been shut to her at the start, she found herself too often kept at a desk, her field genius underused, by a service that a younger, freer world would have built around her. She retired in 1966. She died in 1982, still largely unknown to the public she had served, a private woman who had kept her own extraordinary secrets to the end. For decades, the most dangerous of all Allied spies was also one of the most forgotten. She is, at last. In recent years, Virginia Hall has finally begun to receive the recognition she spent her life avoiding. The CIA has honored her as one of its founding legends and named a building for her. Her story has reached millions through books and film, and a woman her own government, once judged unfit to sit at a diplomat's desk, is now held up as one of the greatest intelligence officers the United States ever produced. She died in 1982, at 76, having told almost no one the full truth of what she did. The airmen she smuggled out of France, the agents she broke out of prison, the resistance fighters she armed for the liberation. Most of them never knew the name of the limping American woman who changed their lives. She seems to have preferred it that way. Her own country told Virginia Hall she could not be a diplomat, she was a woman, and she had lost a leg. So she became, instead, the spy the Gestapo feared above all others, running the secret war against the Nazis across occupied France on one through their fingers to the very end. The enemy understood her value perfectly. The enemies of all Allied spies. They called her the most dangerous of all Allied spies. It only took her own side about 50 years to agree. People still wonder how many other agents like Virginia Hall, women and disabled veterans and others the era overlooked, did extraordinary, secret things that history never properly recorded, precisely because the work was secret and the doers were the kind of people the age preferred not to celebrate. Maybe your own family carries one of those quiet stories. If your mother, your grandmother, your grandfather, anyone in your family served in the SOE, the OSS, the Resistance, or any part of the secret war, in any country or any role, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, or said, or one thing you remember. The people who fought in the shadows deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.